Okay, for this lecture, I'm going to talk about the Constitution and the formation of the two-party system in early American history, our first political parties. This lecture, I'll just tell you, it could go really long and have tons of details, and I'm going to do my absolute best to keep myself on a timer and to keep this brief. The reason I'm doing that is because I am going to see you guys in class now, and I really encourage you to discuss this with me, and we can go further in class. So this is going to be out there for Thursday, my Thursday and Friday in-person kids. Please ask questions. If you're all virtual, please email me or reach out to me, and I'll connect with you maybe through a Google Meet, and then Monday, Tuesday, kids next week, definitely let's come back to this. But I'm just going to try to give you a crash course and really hit the highlights of the U.S. Constitution and early political parties. First thing to know about our Constitution. The Constitutional Convention was in 1787, and it's going to be put together that summer, sent out, ratified, approved, and put into effect by 1789. The first thing to know, it's built on compromises. There's something called the Great Compromise. This is about proportional versus equal representation in Congress. Should big states have power, or should every state have an equal say? This leads to things like a bicameral legislature, a House and a Senate, and it still shapes how our government works today. The Three-Fifths Compromise and the Slave Trade Compromise obviously deal with this important moral issue, but also one that at this point had become an economic issue in our new nation. The Three-Fifths Compromise dealt with how do you count slaves towards population and power, and the Slave Trade Compromise, it was the early discussion on when and how slavery, or specifically the international slave trade, could be abolished. Another area of compromise is this Enlightenment idea of separation of powers. Our Constitution has separation of powers all throughout it, both with the three branches, legislative, executive, judicial, and checks and balances, but also in the form of federalism, national power versus state power, and delegated versus things that are reserved to states. The layout of the Constitution. Our Constitution is essentially 7 articles long. I've listed them out here, each of the 7 articles. One thing that I do want to highlight, the very first article of our Constitution deals with the legislative branch. This is because our founding fathers felt that the lawmaking body was the most important part of our government. So, today we might give a lot of prestige and influence to the president or the executive branch or to the Supreme Court, but at our nation's founding, the legislative branch was meant to be the ultimate seat of power. A few clauses in that first article, the interstate commerce clause and the necessary and proper clause. These are things that we really need to get our head around, because debates over these 2 clauses will come up again and again throughout American history. There are clauses and pieces of each of these other articles that we'll talk about more throughout the year, but I won't go into that now unless you have questions. Finally, though, on the Constitution, there was built in an amendment process. One of the great things about our Constitution is that it was not a fixed document, and it provided a method for amendment and change so that it could flex. It could have a flexibility to meet the needs of the country at different stages in history. So the amendment process was built in, and over the course of our history, we have now had 27 amendments added. Just so you know, the amendment process is a difficult process to get done. So our Constitution allows itself to be changed, but that's not easy, and it's going to take a significant threshold to get the support for an amendment. The first 10 amendments are obviously the Bill of Rights. I'm sure you've learned about those some before. We'll talk about all of those throughout the year, but I definitely want to highlight that 10th Amendment. This is the Reserved Powers States' Right Amendment. It says all powers not specifically granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. This is where things throughout history, like, let's just say marriage, birth, and death. Things involving marriage, birth, and death have typically been things that are reserved to the states. If you think about that, marriage and birth as it relates to pro-life and pro-choice space, these are some of the most heated arguments. And of course, slavery fell into that debate as well when the abolition movement began in the 1800s. So this 10th Amendment, reserved powers or states' rights, will come back again and again throughout the year. Finally, when the Constitution was trying to be ratified, we've talked about this some. Federalists were for the Constitution. They favored this stronger central government. Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution. At least they were against it without the Bill of Rights. They felt like the Constitution without a Bill of Rights was too strong, and they only agreed to ratify the Constitution under the agreement that these first 10 amendments would be added. These two factions, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, start us on the path towards our first two parties in American history. Now, the early two-party system, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. These are our first two political parties. Today we have Democrats and Republicans, but back then it was Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The Federalists largely were led by Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and John Adams. The Democratic Republicans were largely led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Essentially, early decision-making in Washington's cabinet as they dealt with domestic and foreign issues, Hamilton and Jefferson continually offered two opposing viewpoints. And I've listed out 5 of them here. A national bank, an excise tax, funding of the national debt at par, or that means at face value, the assumption of state debts, and a tariff for revenue and protection. Long story short, Alexander Hamilton was for all of these things. These are things that he and the Federalists supported. And I kind of put the acronym over here, or the acrostic, I'm not sure what is what. BFAT, B-E-F-A-T. The Federalists in general favored a big fat government. And what I mean by that is strong, not necessarily controlling, but proactive, a bit more hands-on, and a stronger role for government, national government, in the lives of everyday citizens. On the other hand, Jefferson and Madison, they advocated more for the state's perspective and or the common man. Sometimes Washington and Hamilton were considered elitist and favoring the merchant wealthy class, whereas Jefferson and Madison kind of take that voice of the common man and the state's perspective. They felt that a national bank was unconstitutional. They felt that an excise tax put financial strain on farmers and common Americans. They felt that we should pay our foreign debts, but domestic debts were just helping speculators and elite stock traders. Most southern states had already paid their debts, and they felt that a little bit of a tariff was okay for revenue, but a high protective tariff hurt southern agriculture and was unconstitutional. So these issues and these positions are the foundation of this first two-party system. In 1789, we would not have said we had Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Different historians point to different issues on when these parties actually formed. Some say they revolved or they formed around the bank argument. Others really point to the secret agreement about state debts and the relocation of the capital from New York to Washington, D.C. And then some historians actually say the formation of political parties was more tied to foreign policy. So one last issue that helped to fuel the formation of these two political parties was foreign policy. Federalists tended to be more pro-British, and the Democratic Republicans tended to be more pro-France. So when Britain and France go to war on the back end of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic wars and expansion, Democratic Republicans said we needed to side with France, and Federalists, generally for trade and economic reasons, said we needed to side with Britain. This leads us into the discussion of things like the Neutrality Proclamation and Jay's Treaty and a few other events in the 1790s. We'll talk more about foreign policy next week, but I do want you to see that all of these were instrumental in forming the first two political parties in American history. Okay. Let's see, I kept that to about 10 and a half minutes. Please, there's so much more that we can go on all of these issues. So please read, ask questions, and let's try to get this stuff in our brain. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you soon.